Hello, everybody. We're very happy today to have Dr. Shelley Miller with us, who's going to talk about the 5 misperceptions surrounding the environmental impacts of single-use plastic. Shelley is the Jonathan W. Bulkley Collegiate Professor in Sustainable Systems at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. An environmental engineer by training, Miller's research is highly interdisciplinary with a focus on life cycle assessment and systems analysis of emerging products. Her research has been featured by various media outlets, including NPR, Time, the BBC, Forbes, Consumer Reports, and The Guardian. So we're very happy to have her with us today. Welcome, Shelley. Questions for her, use the question and answer Q&A at the bottom, and our analyst, Miguel Hernandez, will ask them to her for you. Take it away, Shelley.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thanks to Earthshift for this opportunity to share some research with you all. And thank you all for coming and spending part of your day on this topic, which is 5 misperceptions of single-use plastic. And so I'm going to go through a number of slides, but the full paper can be found in Environmental Science and Technology. Most of the information and a lot more detail can be found in the paper. If you don't actually have access to Environmental Science and Technology, please feel free to email me at shelleym@umich.edu, and I'm happy to provide a reprint for you. And so with that as an introduction, I think most of the folks on this call are probably very familiar with the concept of life cycle assessment. The overall findings in this are largely drawn from the life cycle assessment community, which of course is a systematic process of looking at all of the materials and energy throughout an entire life cycle and supply chain of a product. And so we're going to be looking at plastic, which of course is a very hot topic in the environmental news these days. And looking through as we're starting to think about various solutions to the plastic problem, what is actually going to be overall environmentally beneficial from an entire supply chain life cycle perspective, and what might cause some unintended consequences along the way as we try to solve one problem and try to make sure that we don't solve or we don't create additional problems. And so with that, I'm going to present 5 different misperceptions that many consumers have about single-use plastic that is not often backed up by the life cycle assessment literature. So we're going to go through each of these in turn. And so some of you may find these not at all surprising, and some of these might be actually fairly surprising to some folks. So the major 5 misperceptions that we're going to explore include: plastic packaging is the largest contributor to a product's environmental impact. It's not. The environmental impacts of plastic are generally greater than all other packaging materials. They tend not to be. Reusable products are always better than single-use plastics. They're not always. Recycling and composting should be our highest priority. We'll talk about how, yes, recycling and composting definitely have a purpose in plastics solutions, but maybe not should be our highest priority. And then finally, that zero waste efforts that eliminate single-use plastics are the things that are going to minimize the environmental impact of an event. And that's a little bit one that's a little bit more nuanced, but we'll certainly talk about that as we get there. So I want to talk a little bit about the motivation for this work. This motivation came out of a study that we did that was a fairly typical life cycle assessment study conducted. The lead author was a PhD student, a former PhD student of mine, Brent Hurd. And he was looking at the comparative life cycle impacts between a meal kit, something like Blue Apron or HelloFresh, and the same meal that is sourced from a grocery store. It was a pretty typical LCA study. And it found that on balance, when you look at grocery store meals compared to meal kits actually have about a third less environmental impact associated with a variety of different impact categories. The main difference being that meal kits did have more solid waste associated with packaging. People were very surprised by this study. People, at least outside of the LCA community, were very surprised by this study. Because of the amount of packaging that consumers often perceived. And so what we did find is that packaging, whether you were talking about a grocery store system or the meal kit system, had about 10% of the overall environmental impact, again, across a number of environmental impact categories. But what was actually much more important in the meal kit study was the amount of food and food waste, the amount of energy emissions in retail, and meal kits actually bypass brick and mortar retail and so avoid those emissions, and also fewer overall last mile problems, so driving to and from the grocery store. So these results were not necessarily surprising to the LCA community, but were often really challenged when put in front of a broader audience. And it really came down to this idea of, I see the plastics, I see the packaging. How is it possible that the meal kits can actually have lower environmental impact? And that really got me thinking in how we as an LCA community really think through and communicate some of these results. And so a lot of the discussions I had surrounding this particular article led to these 5 misperceptions that I present overall. And I do want to make a couple of caveats before we get into the misperceptions. So our study showed, 10% of life cycle impacts were involved with packaging in both of these studies. 10% of everything, considering most things come in a package, is a lot. And so when we start talking about overall environmental impacts of packaging, they can be tremendous. And we know that the impact of plastics and the growth of the industry is rapidly expanding. So this talk is not intended to downplay the environmental impacts of plastics, but is really trying to talk through some of the potential trade-offs of plastics and other materials that we may be seeing as we search for solutions to these very real plastics problems. So again, some disclaimers. The use and improper disposal of plastic have led to major environmental impacts, particularly with respect to physical ecosystem damage in marine environments. Those things are very difficult to measure in LCA. We tend to do a much more effective job in measuring greenhouse gas emissions, measuring energy use throughout a life cycle, and air quality, and some water emissions. We tend to struggle, although I know that there are groups that are actively working on creating marine litter indicators and other ways of measuring physical damage from plastic waste. And so that is something that we as a community are grappling with. And so many of the studies are going to be focusing more on greenhouse gases and other emissions that are not necessarily going to incorporate some of the marine damage associated with plastics. And then I also want to point out this idea of having fewer impact does not necessarily mean something is good. So a lot of the LCA studies are comparative in nature. Plastics do not get a pass just as anything else. But again, we are trying to reduce overall environmental impact. And so I just want to highlight those things as we move on through here. Okay, so let's get on to our misperceptions. Our first misperception that we are going to explore is that plastic packaging is the largest contributor to environmental impact of a product. And we see this again and again where consumers tend to prioritize the environmental friendliness of the package without necessarily considering what's inside the package. So the LCA insight that we're going to talk about and explore is it's generally the product that's inside the package that's usually responsible for the majority of environmental impact of the product, not the package that it comes in. And so this really comes down to this idea that packaging is one of the most visible environmental impacts that we as consumers can see. We can see the packaging, we have to deal with the packaging. And I think that is one of the big crux issues of communicating life cycle assessment results, is that the majority of environmental impacts of our products tend to be entirely invisible to customers. People can see the packaging waste, they can see solid waste, maybe they're thinking about energy use or water use in their households, but usually it's the things that they have to throw out, recycle, compost that are the most visible and then therefore the most visceral in terms of things that we think about environmental impact. As life cycle assessment practitioners know, that the majority of the impact often happens upstream in the extraction and manufacturing phase before the product ever gets to us. And then any sort of invisible energy use in terms of electricity use during the process. Certainly end of life has its own emissions, but again, the majority of emissions tends to happen upstream and be invisible, whereas packaging is very, very visible. We had one of my students in my research group, Mangchun Khan, did a great study for her master's thesis that was looking at this idea of how much does plastic contribute to environmental impacts totally of a product. And so she did a meta-analysis of different kinds of food products, looking only at plastic packaging and saying how much environmental impact does that plastic packaging contribute to the overall life cycle of the products. Results here are a little complicated, but what you see, and you may not be able to read the titles, across is a variety of different environmental impact categories. The bar here on the left-hand side is climate change. So greenhouse gas emissions are the most often reported in these life cycle assessment studies. The blue bar means that the package has less than 5% of the overall impact. And so 5%, you can see the blue bar is the majority of the studies, less than 5% of each of these food products studied. Is going to be plastic packaging. The orange bar is less than 10%. And so you do see a few packages that represent more than 20% of the impact of the product, but the vast majority of the environmental impacts in the vast majority of products is going to be the product itself, the food product itself, not the packaging. And so this really shows then that packaging really is a minor contributor overall. Meanwhile, the actual food inside of the packaging is much more impactful. So moving along to our second misperception that we see is that plastic of all different packaging materials is going to have the most environmental impact of all packaging materials. And this is a very, very common perception of consumers. There's a number of studies that look at consumer perception as far as relative plastic impacts compared to other alternatives of materials, glass, metal, paperboard. And by and large, consumers believe that the plastic is going to be the most environmentally impactful. The LCA insight is that plastic is often responsible for fewer environmental impacts than many common packaging materials. And again, that doesn't necessarily always include the marine litter and how that is weighed. And so there is definitely a trade-off there. But again, looking at greenhouse gases and a variety of other impact categories, it does tend to be that plastics often have fewer environmental impact than other packaging materials. And so anyone who works in life cycle assessment knows it's very, very difficult to generalize. Individual results are obviously going to vary depending on the system. But when you look through the bulk of the literature, what we see in terms of packaging, at least, is that packages such as aluminum and glass and metals tend to be more environmentally intensive than plastics, largely because of how environmentally intensive their manufacturing is. And so because they require so much energy to produce, they tend to have higher greenhouse gases and often other impact categories as well compared to plastics. That's largely due to the emissions intensity of our grid. So as our grid does decarbonize, that comparison is likely going to become closer together. Meanwhile, when you look at things like reusable glass or paperboard products, it tends to be much more system specific when you compare to a plastic alternative, whether or not one material is better than the other, and often you see a lot more different trade-offs among impact categories there. There was a recent McKinsey report that I'll point out, for those of you who have not seen it, it came out just a couple weeks ago, that showed that they looked across various sectors, so not just the packaging sector, but lots of different types of sectors where plastics are used. They found that compared to the next viable non-plastic alternative, plastics had fewer greenhouse gas emissions in 13 of the 14 applications that they looked at. And so again, that's highlighting that, particularly from a global warming perspective, plastics do tend to have reduced environmental impacts compared to analogous materials to be used for similar applications. So this certainly has some really important things to be thinking about as we're talking about packaging shifts, as we're talking about converting potential plastic packages to single-use glass. In terms of we may be taking away a marine litter problem, but also introducing some other impacts in terms of upstream impacts that we need to be thoughtful about and careful about. So moving on to our next misperception that many folks have in the consumption world is this idea of reusable products, and that reusable products are always going to be better than single-use plastics, universally, no matter what. And the results are actually quite a bit more nuanced, where the LCA insight is reusable products often have lower environmental impacts, but only if they are actually reused a significant number of times in order to compensate for their greater materials intensity. And so that's, I think, a piece of the puzzle that consumers aren't often thinking about in terms of, in order to have a reusable product, we often need a whole lot more materials to make it more durable. And that durability actually has to be compensated by being reused a number of times. And so my sort of simple graphic for this is just thinking through a durable, heavy-duty plastic bottle that, we might carry around all the time in terms of water bottle. If you're just talking about, is it better to have one single reusable bottle than one single thin film PET bottle, the materials intensity of that thick bottle is going to far outweigh the environmental intensity of that thin film plastic. So we need to reuse that reusable water bottle many, 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 many times in order to be able to compensate for that additional material intensity and actually make single-use plastics greater intensive overall compared to the reusable bottle. And so there's usually a tipping point. We can call it a break-even point, at which the reusable alternative has been used enough times in order to compensate for the single-use product. And that can be often a lot larger than people expect. And so often we think of, oh, well, we'll just get a new water bottle every season, or we'll just get, however many reusable water bottles, rather than really thinking through how many times does something have to be reused before it actually becomes environmentally less intensive. And so another student in my group, Hannah Fettner, put together a really nice study looking at different kitchenware products on how many times each of the kitchenware products would need to be reused before it broke even with the single-use product. And so she looked at 4 different classes of products. So single-use plastic straws, paperboard coffee cups with a plastic lid, plastic single-use forks, and plastic wrap or single thin film plastic baggies. And so you see the results here. And so you'll see things like metal straws, for example, metal reusable straws have to be reused almost 250 times before they are actually less environmentally impactful than the single-use counterpart. I will point out that this is just looking at greenhouse gas emissions. She also did look at a couple of other impact categories. I just limited it to greenhouse gases here because the break-even points change depending on whether you're talking about energy use or water use. But these give you a decent idea. You'll see we can get some sort of generalizable results here. The single-use plastic fork, actually the alternatives of the reusables are actually pretty low. So the bamboo, the reusable plastic durable fork, and the metal forks all have fairly low, below 10 reuses to pay back their energy intensity. And that makes a lot of sense because when you think through a single-use plastic fork, there's already a good bit of durability built into that in order to have sufficient technical performance to be able to perform as a fork. Therefore, there's already a decent amount of plastic in it that is not going to be compensated by superior material intensity of some of these alternates. One of the things that Hannah found that were frankly disappointing to both of us, is that there are certain reusable products that actually she couldn't find a break-even point for. And so this was bamboo straws as a replacement for plastic straws. The lifetime of the bamboo straws degraded and needed to be replaced before you actually found a break-even point here. But the one that is often fairly disappointing to many folks who are trying to live environmentally conscious lifestyles is that she couldn't find a break-even point for either beeswax wrap or silicone reusable sandwich bags when compared to plastic wrap or single-use baggies. And that is not to say that these products have a great deal of environmental impact. What it really shows is that single-use plastic film has such low material intensity that any sort of washing emissions associated with these reusable products actually are greater than making that thin film itself. And so they're basically, and this assumes that the reusable product is washed after every use. We do have some scenarios in this particular paper that do look at alternative washing when, you only have something like crackers or pretzels in a bag and you don't necessarily have to rewash it. So we do account for those scenarios in this. But again, this is highlighting the idea that reusable products do need to be reused in order for them to be better environmentally. And also there are some reusable products that actually don't compete with plastics on various environmental impact categories for certain reusable products. All right, so moving along to misperception number 4 that is often seen is the idea of composting and recycling as should be highest priority over all other environmental activities. And so again, a number of behavior scientists have looked at consumer perceptions of composting and recycling and see that consumers really prize recycled content and compostable content higher than any other environmental attribute. And from the LCA perspective, certainly it's not from an LCA perspective that we shouldn't compost or recycle, but the environmental benefits associated with recycling and composting tend to be very small compared to efforts to reduce overall consumption or other things that can happen throughout the life cycle to reduce overall impact. The end of life piece tends to be pretty small, generally speaking. And so there are numerous waste hierarchies that are published that show this graphically, where prevention, minimization, dematerialization, any sort of reduced consumption of materials are going to have a much greater impact than recycling. Recycling tends to be right down there just above energy recovery on a waste hierarchy pyramid. And there really is that, when you look at the environmental impact, reduce tends to be, again, generalities here, but reduce of consumption tends to be the highest bang for the buck opportunity. Reuse tends to be next, and then recycle when reduce and reuse fail. And so recycling does reduce the amount of virgin resources used, generally speaking, but it still requires energy to collect materials, to consolidate them, and to reprocess them into new products. And certainly there are issues of downcycling and recycling markets associated as well. So again, I'm not saying that recycling should not be part of the overall strategy, but in terms of trying to shape overall prioritization, recycling is maybe not going to be the thing that should be most promoted and most pronounced in people's minds. Composting is of a similar vein, and composting is a bit more complicated in lots of ways. We'll talk just more specifically about composting of plastics in this talk. Composting of food is a bit of a different conversation, but since we're talking about plastics in this talk, a couple of things to be thinking about in terms of composting. The first is that it can be trying to recycle, well-intentioned consumers trying to recycle compostable plastics can contaminate recycled plastic streams. And so really having that communication with consumers can be really difficult, of saying, well, just because it's plastic, this particular kind of plastic can't be recycled, it needs to be composted. And that's not always a clear strategy in consumers' mind. And then the other piece, and this comes again from the environmental trade-offs perspective, is that when you look at the greenhouse gases associated with composting plastics, they tend to have higher energy and greenhouse gas emissions than other end-of-use options. This is largely because if you keep plastic in a solid, steady state, that sequesters carbon. If you do something to it to anaerobically digest it, incinerate it, any sort of thing like that, composting is going to actually release carbon to the environment. If you anaerobically digest it and then use that methane for energy recovery, you're going to have a better greenhouse gas profile. So composting actually tends to have a worse greenhouse gas perspective than other end-of-use lifetime alternatives for plastics. Because again, you're creating gaseous emissions of carbon rather than sequestering it in a steady solid state. And so those are dealing with the fourth misperception. And so moving right along to our fifth and final misperception that we'll discuss is the idea of zero waste efforts, zero waste events that are becoming increasingly popular. And often they are seen as, if we focus on elimination of single-use plastic to minimize the environmental impacts of an event, that's the best thing we can do environmentally. From an LCA perspective, again, it's not that diversion from landfill is not a good thing. Yes, that's a good thing. But the benefits of diverting waste from landfill are relatively small. When you look at mindful consumption, overall waste reduction, and the types and amount of products that are consumed at the event, that actually can be much, much more impactful. And so it's more than just putting out recycling bins and making sure we don't have single-use plastic to landfill. It's a much broader conversation than that. And so there's a couple of reasons why, as we're thinking through and advising people on zero waste events, we just might want to bring a word of caution. And so one of the things that we've observed with these zero waste events is that very well-intentioned organizers are trying to think through, oh, how can we still have giveaways, or how can we still actually, have a great experience, but then also not have anything to landfill. And so what you'll often see is various reusable giveaways at these events. So back to misperception number 3, if it's reusable, it's always better. Any sort of giveaway that happens at a zero waste event actually has to be reused by the participants of the event. And so I feel like I've been to any number of zero waste events where they have those sort of cheap plastic cups that say, hey, they're reusable, and so therefore this is a zero waste event. But the thing is I never reuse those cups. And I know a lot of people don't reuse those cups. And so what we're trading in single-use products for more durable, reusable cups that don't necessarily get reused. And that can be true of a lot of the giveaways. And so it really is kind of this idea of, if there are going to be giveaways at a zero waste event that are intended to be reused, being fairly sure that the audience actually will reuse them is going to be key. But I think even a bigger issue of zero waste events, and again, things to be mindful of as we, as a society, are trying to do better, is this idea that zero waste in the form of zero waste single-use plastic has a real potential to detract from larger sustainability issues, where interventions can have a much greater impact than reduction of single-use plastic. And so waste diversion does improve environmental impact, but the graph on the right is a sort of simple thought exercise that our team did that, again, is reported in the overall 5 misperceptions paper that looked at a 100-person event that served hamburgers and bottled water as a baseline, and said the organizers of this event are trying to do environmental good and trying to reduce the environmental impacts of their event. They look at 4 different potential interventions for the event. The 2 scenarios on the right are zero waste single-use plastic scenarios. The one on the far right is eliminate all single-use plastic from the event and tell participants that they should bring their own reusable bottle to the event and we'll have water for you. And you can see that has some improvement in the event. We also have a scenario of zero waste where we still serve water bottles, but we have recycling stations everywhere and we have 100% plastic from the event is recycled. And again, you can see a thin, small bar there where there is an improvement in plastic. But that's just the plastic waste side. When you actually look at the environmental impact of the event, the vast majority of environmental impact is on the burger side. And so the two bars on the left are two different intervention scenarios. The first is trading in beef burgers for veggie burgers, black bean burgers in this sense. And you can see several orders of magnitude improvement greater than recycling single-use bottles. And so that really does highlight that sort of what's inside the package tends to be more impactful than the package itself adage, but may not necessarily be top of organizers' minds. But even if you don't go to an entirely vegetarian event, the second bar is just reducing the portion size of the burger. So they were third-pound burgers. We go to, I believe, a quarter-pound burger. And so reducing that size, which also probably reduces food waste because a third-pound burger is quite a bit to get your mouth around sometimes for lunch, that still has orders of magnitude difference just by changing the portion sizes of meat that are served. And so again, it isn't that the zero waste event and the focus on zero waste to landfill is bad. It does have an improvement. But in terms of minimizing the environmental impact of event, it tends to be pretty small potatoes compared to the actual food and food choices and portion sizes of the other pieces of the event. Okay. So we've gone through a lot of material, but just to summarize the 5 misperceptions that I've presented, plastic packaging is not the largest contributor to a product's environmental impact. It's the product itself, not the packaging. Second, the environmental impacts of plastics are not all greater than all other packaging materials. The individual systems may vary, but it does tend to be that plastics, at least on greenhouse gas emissions and often on other impacts, are lower or at least have trade-offs with other different materials. Reusable products are not always better than single-use products. And again, there tends to be a break-even point at which reusables are better, and the reusables actually need to be reused. Fourth, recycling and composting should not be our highest priority. They can help and they're part of the solution, but they are not the solution that we need to be absolute focused on as terms of priority number 1. And then finally, zero waste events efforts that eliminate single-use plastics do not minimize the environmental impact of the event. They can help. Zero waste events and diversion from landfill can be part of the solution, but we don't want it to detract from other interventions that can have a much, much greater environmental impact. And so with that and some overall takeaways, and I'll be really excited to hear questions and discussion, is this real need to promote holistic systems thinking, life cycle thinking, rather than having simple heuristics of just saying, let's eliminate all single-use plastic. Well, if we eliminate all single-use plastic, what does that mean in terms of what we're getting in terms of trade-offs? And it's important to acknowledge those trade-offs that do exist. The issues of marine litter and greenhouse gas emissions, and thinking through, where do we need to prioritize one versus the other, because there's such a geographic component to where marine litter is a major risk issue and a major source, and where is greenhouse gas emissions going to be more important in terms of plastic solutions. And then, of course, we always try to find these win-win solutions, and sometimes they do exist. And in this case, thinking through ways to lower overall consumption do tend to be win-win solutions. Reusables that will be actually reused in practice that actually do break even can reduce environmental impact. And then, of course, circular economy strategies of plastic when appropriate to do so, can also really be part of the overall strategy for the plastics problem. And so with that, I will thank my collaborators and my research team who contributed to the studies that I've presented, National Science Foundation for providing some partial funding for this work, and then again, there's a lot more detail in the paper of the 5 misperceptions. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Shelley. So very interesting it all was. We do have questions for you. Our analyst, Miguel Hernandez. Welcome, Miguel.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Shelley, for that insightful presentation. We have a couple of questions about communications, and they basically are around how do we do a better job of communicating life cycle information when customers have perceptions that differ from the LCA results?
Yeah, and I think that's one of those that's going to take a community effort to really think through better communication strategies, because the visible is really, really hard it's really hard to visualize the invisible, right? And so even thinking through and telling people, I mean, that's why one of the things about climate change is so hard. We're starting to see visible impacts, and it seems like that's what's really getting people interested and concerned in a way that when it was more invisible or more theoretical, it was a really difficult road. And so I think it is continuing to think through, how do we creatively visualize upstream emissions? How do we creatively communicate that, right? In terms of, thinking through, what does an infographic look like as far as what the actual upstream emissions are? And maybe it's about greenhouse gas emissions, maybe it's about mining emissions, maybe it's about all of the solid waste that actually happens upstream. I think, it's not just going to be about telling people, it's about actually really trying to think through visualizations and continuing the consistent message of just because you see the plastic or just because you see the packaging doesn't mean that's the whole story.
Okay, thank you. We have another one related to microplastics. So does this misconception apply also to microplastics?
So I think, when we're talking about that, really comes down to the trade-off issues, right? Where the LCA metrics that we tend to be best at measuring tend to be things like greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, various other emissions. Microplastics is very difficult because it falls under that physical ecosystem damage, and sort of drawing that cause and effect between microplastics in marine litter and actual physical damage is difficult. I do know that there are groups who are working on it, right? And so it is one of those things where, just like any LCA where there are trade-offs, there are trade-offs when you start talking about single-use plastics in the terms of marine litter and also greenhouse gas emissions, right? So just because something is lower in greenhouse gas emissions doesn't eliminate the fact that you can have leakage of single-use plastics and damage to ecosystems. Those things coexist, but we deal with that in LCA all the time when we talk about bio-based products and increased eutrophication potential versus decreased GWP, right? So we deal with those kind of trade-offs. And so then it becomes really important to think through, all right, so does this type of single-use plastic application in this particular country, is that going to be a major contributor to microplastics that have ecosystem damage? The solution there, in terms of how we think about alternatives and plastic bans and that sort of thing, may be very different than if we're talking about a landlocked community that has really good municipal solid waste infrastructure with very, very minimal risk of actually contributing to marine pollution. And so I do think we need a little bit more nuance in those trade-off analysis as we're thinking, again, rather than those broad things of all single-use plastics cause microplastic pollution, which causes ecosystem damage. It does tend to be fairly localized.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about labeling. So what's your opinion on carbon labeling or carbon packaging?
So I think there's a lot of potential there. I think It's always difficult to come up with a single number in LCA in terms of carbon labeling. I mean, for as long as I've been in this field, we've talked about putting environmental labels on packages, and there's always arguments in terms of, our error bounds tend to be really high. And then, a lot of people want to be able to look in a particular product category across different companies. And being able to do that can be very, very difficult. I think if we were able to come up with a way of being able to showcase, okay, here's where carbon is coming from, and be able to do that in a way that isn't going to be so incredibly costly in terms of having to do an LCA on every single product that exists, I think it has a lot of potential. But I do think, there's so many discussions to be had around what that means to have a carbon label. But I think it would be a great thing to do if we can get through the complexities of doing it.
Okay, thank you. And now, when looking for a solution, should we focus more on changing the consumer behavior or the company's or corporate behavior?
Well, so I think they tend to go hand in hand, right? So when you talk about consumers and you talk about companies, companies are often reacting to what consumers want. And I know that I have a lot of friends in industry who have done an LCA on a package and have said, hey, the plastic package actually tends to be lower impactful, but we're still getting blowback from customers on having a plastic package. So this is what we're going to go with. And so I think it's more of a yes and rather than an either or. You do see companies that are shipping companies that are saying, hey, this plastic bag is actually way less material intensive than our smallest cardboard box, right? And that's definitely part of consumer education of trying to say, yes, it is plastic. We recognize it's plastic, but it also has less environmental impact. And so I think it is tackling both the consumer side of things and helping consumers understand beyond just the visible, what they can see in their household, and also helping companies navigate the space. Again, if you end up with a package that ends up being slightly more impactful, packaging tends to be pretty minor. So focusing on the product itself may be a better way of dealing with that trade-off and saying, yes, we know we have a more impactful package, but we're going to focus our efforts on what's inside that package itself.
Thank you. We have a couple more. Most of the examples that you discussed focused on relative greenhouse gas emissions. However, single-use plastic have major impacts on ocean ecosystems. How do you incorporate these impacts into your analysis?
Sure. And again, this goes to any good LCA should be looking at more than just greenhouse gas emissions. We tend to focus on greenhouse gas emissions because those are what is easy to measure. But a couple of the studies I showed, showed across different environmental impact categories. And just as eutrophication has a different overall impact, every product is going to have a different impact relative to each of the categories. And certainly single-use plastics, particularly in certain geographies, are going to flash hot in terms of marine plastic pollution, right? And so, as I mentioned, it's really thinking through, okay, is this product a high leakage potential product? Like, what is the actual risk factor that it will end up in an ecosystem? For some products, that's going to be greater than others. In some countries or in some places that are closer to water bodies, that's going to be higher than others. And just as we do any sort of trade-off analysis in environmental assessment, we have to be thinking about marine litter compared to its greenhouse gas emissions, compared to its ecotoxicity perspective, compared to its smog formation potential, right? And so just as we do with anything, or should do with anything, we need to be thinking about it in the same context with marine litter. Yes, absolutely, marine litter is important and we need to address it. Does that take priority over everything else? I don't think that it does, or at least not in every context.
Okay, and finally, what's your opinion on plastic bag bans? Is it effective for reducing the environmental impact?
So I think, when we start talking about plastic bag bans, I think that's where we need to think about a really localized approach and be thinking about, as we start talking about plastic bags, there's a couple of things of the misperceptions that come in pretty strongly. One is, what's going to be the alternative? So if we don't have plastic bags, what are we going to use instead? And then the other is this reusability trap. Is everybody just going to start buying canvas bags every single time they need a plastic bag, and everybody has a closet full of canvas bags that are incredibly environmentally impactful, right? And so we have to always put it in that context. I would say in situations and locations where you have a good bit of marine leakage from single-use plastic bags, so coastal areas, different countries where you do have poor municipal collection, various other contexts like that, I would say at a beach, yes, by all means, let's think about a plastic bag ban. If you're talking about, the middle of rural United States that doesn't have any major water body around it, I'm not necessarily sure that a plastic bag ban makes sense, again, in terms of what the alternatives will be. And so again, I think that's where we do need to think in terms of policy approaches, much more about, well, where is the major environmental impact happening? What are the sources of these plastic bags? And then tailor policy solutions as appropriate. So I guess I'd hesitate to say LCA says plastic bag ban good or bad, but in a much more nuanced context of at what point and where do plastic bag bans make sense and where do they not make as much sense?
Okay, thank you very much, Shelley.
Yeah, I guess if we don't have any more questions, we'll end the webinar now. Thanks so much, Shelley and Miguel. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. What an interesting conversation we've had.
Thank you all.